I am just walking home. I didn't break any law. You have no right to detain me like this.
Step back, sir. I need you to comply with my instructions right now.
In the middle of a busy afternoon, on a street that everyone hurried along as usual, an ICE team believed they were handling a mission all too familiar. An anonymous tip had just been delivered. No documentation. No independent verification. Just a vague description of a black man in a general area. To team leader Cole Harkins, that was enough. He believed it would be a quick approach. A brief check. And everything would be over before anyone noticed. But the moment the car slowed to the side of the road and the agent stepped out, the situation began to deviate from its intended course. The man they were targeting didn't run. He didn't seem flustered. He stopped, stood tall, his eyes calm, the look of someone who knew exactly what he was up against. ICE took that calmness as an unusual sign. They didn't know that this man wasn't just any random citizen. He was Special Agent Darius Coleman, an FBI agent operating under an authorized federal mission. Cole Harkins approached first, his voice more commanding than questioning. The other agents quickly positioned themselves, forming an invisible circle of pressure. 4 body cameras were on. 4 microphones were recording every word, every breath. This wasn't a private moment, but a public confrontation between power and procedure. Darius didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply did what federal agents are trained to do in situations like this. He asked for the legal basis of the stop. He offered verification through official channels to resolve things in minutes. A call, a supervisor, a simple confirmation. But ICE wasn't looking for verification. They were looking for obedience. And it was in that moment, when a legal avenue was presented but ignored, that this approach ceased to be a routine enforcement measure. It became the beginning of a fully documented mistake. A mistake that would not stop on this sidewalk, but would follow them straight into the federal courtroom. Cole Harkins didn't see this as a situation requiring clarification. From the very first seconds, he acted as if the conclusion had already been reached. The way he stood, the way he spoke, and the way he signaled to the team made one thing very clear. In his mind, the black man before him was the target, and ICE's job was simply to complete the formality. The remaining agents moved reflexively, like a team accustomed to working together. Grant Hollis moved closer, taking personal space. Evan Price stood slightly behind, maintaining a ready position, but his gaze wasn't entirely at ease. Leah Park, the youngest member of the team, kept a sufficient distance to observe. Her body cam captured the entire moment as all the choices began to take shape. Darius continued to maintain his controlling tone. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He was simply refusing to surrender unconditionally. He repeated his simple request, tell him the legal basis for stopping and conducting verification through official channels. It wasn't defiance. It was procedure. But to Harkins, procedure now felt like a personal challenge. He began using vague language. Routine check. Just cooperate. Phrases that sounded harmless but lacked any concrete basis. When Darius mentioned verification, Harkins didn't respond directly. He brushed it aside, changing the subject, as if the request never existed. And that very disregard was clearly captured on camera. The atmosphere on the sidewalk grew tense. Not because Darius had done anything wrong, but because ICE was pushing the situation in a predetermined direction. Bystanders slowed down. A few phones were raised. No one shouted. No one intervened. But public attention began to build. A pressure Harkins seemed oblivious to. Darius understood perfectly what was happening. He realized this was no longer a question of identity. This was a test of power. And if ICE continued to refuse verification, Every subsequent step would no longer be protected by law, but only by the confidence of those in power. Darius was in plain clothes because the mission required him to look like an ordinary person among ordinary people. In operations like this, drawing badges and publicly revealing identities in public was not only unprofessional, but could also put others in danger. He explained this briefly, without going into detail, just enough for those familiar with the procedure to know that this wasn't just empty talk. He offered a standard federal solution. Call a supervisor. Verify through the operations desk. A call could end the entire interaction in less than 2 minutes. No handcuffs. No tension. No troublesome reporting. But Cole Harkin's reaction showed he didn't consider verification a mandatory step. He saw it as an unnecessary delay. Instead of accepting the offer, Harkins tightened his grip. He gestured with his eyes for Grant Hollis to move closer. The distance narrowed. Personal space vanished. This was a familiar sign of a silent escalation. Evan Price adjusted his position. Still not touching, but ready. Leah Park maintained a wider field of view, and her body cam clearly captured the moment Darius first made his verification request. Harkins didn't publicly reject the verification. He did it more subtly. He feigned not hearing, changed the subject, repeated the request for cooperation. To the uninformed, that sounded reasonable, but in law enforcement, ignoring a legitimate path to verification is a deliberate decision, and the camera was recording that decision. Darius began to understand that ICE wasn't looking for the truth. They were testing how far he would go before giving in. He maintained a calm tone. No resistance. No insults. But he didn't back down either. He repeated the verification request, this time more clearly. And in that moment, the contact crossed the fine line between a legitimate inspection and a crime unfolding right before the camera. This wasn't a deserted alley, not a closed checkpoint. This was a sidewalk in broad daylight, where people continued to pass, albeit slowed by a sense that something was amiss. ICE didn't control this space, and that made every decision they made carry more weight. Eyes began to linger. No one shouted. No one intervened. But phones started appearing in the hands of passers-by. A very modern reflex. Not to cause trouble, but to record. That attention wasn't loud, but enough to change the atmosphere. Encounters like this might look very different when recounted later. But public cameras had no incentive to edit. Cole Harkins didn't adjust his behavior. On the contrary, he became more assertive, his voice firmer, his posture more decisive. For him, stepping back to verify at this moment wasn't just a professional maneuver, but a concession in front of others. And Harkins had no intention of backing down. The initial anonymous tip began to reveal its true nature. No name, no record, no evidence, just a description and an accusation. In the hands of a cautious person, it was reason to question. In Harkins' hands, it became a pretext to assert power. He had decided that the man before him had to prove his innocence, rather than ICE having to prove the reason for his detention. Darius recognized that shift sharply. This was no longer an exchange of information. This was a test of who would control the pace. He maintained his posture, his tone of voice. No action could be interpreted as a threat. But he also didn't give them what they wanted, most blind obedience. And in that moment, amidst the crowded sidewalk and the silently recording cameras, the ego of a commander began to outweigh the law. Up until that point, everything could have been salvaged. Just another decision. Just a verification call. But Cole Harkins chose the other path. He didn't back down. He didn't ease the pressure. Instead, he turned his silence into a command. Harkins gestured briefly. "No need to raise your voice." Grant Hollis understood immediately. He stepped forward, closing the last remaining gap. This was the moment when formal public contact turned into coercion. No new information. No additional evidence. No verification. Only one decision controlled by force. Darius sensed the shift instantly. But he didn't react with panic. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He didn't do anything that could be labeled resistance. When his hand was grasped, he held his voice, held his position. He made it clear that he disagreed with the detention and once again requested verification through official channels. Body cam recorded every detail. The moment Hollis placed his hand on Darius, the moment the handcuffs were removed, and most importantly, there wasn't a single moment showing a new threat emerging to justify the action. Evan Price stood close by, following the formation, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. Leah Park stepped back half a pace, observing and filming. Her camera captured the moment the legal boundary was crossed. More passers-by stopped. The atmosphere on the sidewalk thickened. This wasn't a routine check anymore. This was a man handcuffed in broad daylight, and no one around understood why. And ICE knew it. They knew they were being watched. But instead of stopping and correcting the mistake, Harkins continued onward. Because at this point, admitting the mistake publicly was harder than escalating the situation. And that very decision turned a stoppage that should have ended in a few minutes into a serious civil rights violation. Fully documented. Second by second. As soon as the handcuffs were locked, Cole Harkins' strategy became clear. He wanted to get Darius out of the public space as quickly as possible. Not for safety, but to control the narrative. The crowded sidewalk, with people holding up their phones, was no longer a place he wanted to continue this confrontation. Darius was led toward the car. He remained calm. No resistance. No struggling. No giving ICE any reason to add charges. During the drive, he kept repeating the only thing that could end it immediately, calling his supervisor and verifying his identity through the official federal channel. He wasn't asking to be released. He was asking to be properly checked. But Harkins didn't change his mind. In his head, getting Darius into the car first and then dealing with it later seemed like a solution. That way of thinking was dangerous. Because from this point on, every minute of detention required clear legal justification. And that base never materialized. Inside the car, the atmosphere was different. Fewer stares. Less overt pressure. But the body cameras were still running. The microphones were still recording. And Darius was still saying the same thing, in the same controlling tone. He explained that presenting sensitive documents in the ICE car, without official verification, wasn't safe procedure. He was suggesting the path he'd suggested from the start. Harkins started using excuses. He talked about uncertainty, about safety, about not being able to confirm right now. But the cameras recorded that he was the one refusing to confirm. This wasn't a lack of information. This was deliberate delay. Leah Park continued her role as a cautious observer. Her camera captured the uncomfortable silences in the car, where everyone understood that the issue wasn't Darius's identity, but that ICE had gone too far without an easy way out. Evan Price was quieter. Grant Hollis was in control, but lacked the initial confidence. The detain first, verify later strategy might give a sense of control in the moment, but it leaves a very clear legal trail. And every second spent in that car was turning a wrong decision into an ever-growing record of violations. Minute by minute, when the car stopped at the ICE temporary facility, the atmosphere changed. Gone was the confidence of a swift arrest. Instead, there was the ambivalent feeling of an unproven situation that had been pushed too far. Darius was ushered inside. Still handcuffed. Still calm. Still holding on to a single demand: official identity verification. The process began to operate on a run of routine. Checks. Documentation. Standard questioning. Steps that usually make a detention seem legitimate, even when the initial foundations were flawed. Darius didn't resist the basic security measures, but he didn't let the story veer off course. Every opportunity arose. He brought up the supervisor, the federal verification, the path to ending everything immediately. Cole Harkins continued to stall. He spoke as if time were on his side, as if they held Darius long enough, the truth would bend to conform to the initial decision. But in large systems, the truth doesn't disappear. It just waits until it's forced to surface. Leah Park began to be more explicit in her caution. No public resistance. No confrontation. But she recorded. She asked the right questions. And her camera captured the pauses. The glances. The hesitant words that revealed the uncertainty spreading through the team. The pressure didn't come from the outside first. It came from within. Another employee overheard the assertion FBI agent. A supervisor realized that if that was true, then everything that was happening was a big deal. And as questions began to surface, Harkins was no longer the only one controlling the pace. The call was finally made. Not because Harkins wanted clarification, but because not clarifying had become too dangerous for the system itself. And in just a few short minutes, what Darius had said from the beginning was fully confirmed. The real identity, the legitimate mission, federal authority. The truth emerged quietly, but it weighed heavily on the room. The tone changed. The way people addressed each other changed. The person who had once been treated as a target was now seen as a problem requiring urgent attention. And in that moment, everyone understood that this was no longer a story about stopping. This was the beginning of consequences that no one on the team could avoid. The removal of the handcuffs happened in silence. No formal apology. No clear explanation. Just a sudden shift in how people moved and spoke, as if a simple adjustment of attitude could reverse what had just happened. But some things cannot be reversed, and cameras are one of them. Darius stood up, gently rubbing his wrists, remaining calm. He didn't use this moment to raise his voice or exert pressure. He understood perfectly well that the real power now lay not in that room, but in the recorded data. Every decision, every refusal to verify, every escalation had been time-stamped. Cole Harkins tried to shift his tone to neutral. No more commands. No more initial certainty. But that shift only made it clear that the entire situation was based on assumption, not evidence. And that assumption crumbled the moment Darius's identity was confirmed. Before leaving, Darius said a short, non-threatening sentence. He had had the chance to verify it from the beginning. He chose not to. And every camera in the room recorded that choice. No one objected. No one argued. Because there was nothing to argue about when the truth was clear. Outside, life went on. But inside the system, a chain reaction began. Reports had to be written. Footage had to be saved. Emails had to be sent. And everything had to match what the cameras had recorded. That was the hardest part. Not admitting a mistake, but writing the mistake into an indelible record. Darius left not with a sense of victory, but with certainty. He knew that this story didn't end here. Being released didn't erase his detention. And when power chose to forego verification, the consequences didn't come immediately. They came later. Slowly. But inevitably, Darius didn't consider what had just happened a bad day to forget. He understood something many only realize when it's too late. The most important battle is always the battle of records. And this time, the records were on his side. In the days that followed, Darius acted methodically. He preserved the evidence. He requested the storage of his body cam footage. He recorded the timeline while the details were still clear, not for revenge, but to ensure the truth wasn't obscured by selective memory or later rewritten reports. The federal civil rights lawsuit was filed with a concise and precise argument. The detention was not based on legal grounds. It was based on a vague anonymous tip and assumptions about appearance. More importantly, ICE had repeatedly refused to verify identity through official channels despite clear requests. And that refusal turned a contact into a violation. The government responded with familiar arguments. They talk about good faith, about the uncertainty on the ground, about the pressure to make quick decisions, but those words hit a very hard wall video. In this file, there are no gaps, not a single moment where ICE can say they had no other choice. Darius's lawyers didn't need drama. They just needed to synchronize the cameras. 4 viewpoints, 4 microphones, a seamless timeline. Every time Darius requested verification was tagged. Every time Harkins glanced over or refused was placed alongside it. And every passing minute became evidence that this wasn't a mistake, but a series of conscious decisions. Once the file was complete, the story was no longer about emotion or opinion. It was about data. And the data began to speak for itself, without needing to be debated anymore. When the case entered the federal courtroom, everything was stripped bare. No uniforms, no authority to issue orders, just testimony, evidence, and a large screen where the footage was played minute by minute. Here, the voice was less important than the time, and the time was clearly recorded. The government defense tried to construct its story in a familiar way. They said the ICE agents acted in good faith, that the situation was ambiguous, that Darius's identity couldn't be trusted at the scene. But when those words were spoken, the plaintiff's lawyer simply pressed play. The video showed Darius standing still, calm, complying safely. The video showed him making clear, legal, multiple attempts at verification. And the video also showed Cole Harkins deliberately bypassing that approach. There was no evidence of a new threat. No moment justifying handcuffing first and verification later. Each time Harkins described his actions as routine, the screen paused at the moment he ignored the request for verification. Each time he spoke of safety concerns, the video showed Darius maintaining the same posture, voice, and controlled behavior. The testimonies didn't crumble because of arguments. They crumbled because of comparison. Evan Price was called to the witness stand. Hesitation was evident in each answer. Grant Hollis explained that the use of force was standard, but couldn't pinpoint the moment when that standard was necessary. Leah Park was different. She described the process correctly. She pointed out what was missing, and her testimony perfectly matched the footage. In the courtroom, the jury didn't need deep expertise to understand what was happening. When you have the opportunity to verify and you refuse, it's not a mistake. It's a choice. And that choice was being replayed, second by second, under the unblinking lights of the courtroom. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room fell silent in a very different way. Not with the tension of debate, but with the feeling that everything that needed to be said had been said. The record was complete. The timeline was clear, and there was little room left for ambiguity. The verdict came shortly afterward. Unanimous. Accountability lay with ICE. The detention was unlawful. The refusal to verify was intentional. And the compensation awarded was $15 million. That number wasn't read aloud as a sum of money. It was read aloud as a statement. The $15 million reflected the severity of the violation. It reflected that this wasn't a moment of misunderstanding, but a chain of decisions made in front of cameras, with many opportunities for correction missed. It also reflected the message the jury wanted to send. Power doesn't stand above process. The consequences came quickly. Cole Harkins could no longer continue in his commanding role as before. The incident was too public. The footage was clear. Discipline was no longer an internal choice. It became a mandatory requirement. The career he had built on quick results ended the way he pursued them. The rest of the team didn't escape the consequences either. Grant Hollis was scrutinized for using force too soon. Evan Price faced questions about his obedience when he knew process was being bypassed. Leah Park was viewed differently. Not because she was perfect, but because she acknowledged the issue and tried to keep the contact within legal limits. But the biggest consequences didn't stop at the individual. They spread throughout the entire agency. Because when an incident ends with $15 million and an undeniable record, the system is forced to change. Following the ruling, ICE was forced to do what they hadn't done in the first place. They reevaluated their processes, not voluntarily, but because they had no other choice. New policies were implemented. Identity verification became mandatory when a reasonable request was made. Supervisors had to be contacted in situations based on vague tips. Body cam retention was extended so that no file could disappear before legal review. The system created more friction, precisely where speed and assumptions had previously been prioritized. Those changes exist on paper, but Darius Coleman's story isn't just about policy. It's about a very human moment. A black man, in plain clothes, walking in broad daylight, behaving properly, calmly, and still being considered a target before being considered a person requiring verification. Darius received justice in the legal sense. He received a ruling. He received compensation. There was systemic change. But he also carried an uncomfortable truth. If he hadn't been an FBI agent, if he hadn't had an identity that could be quickly verified through the federal system, would that call ever have been made, or would he have become just another case to be processed, labeled, and then forgotten? That's the question this case leaves unanswered. Not for ICE, not for the court, but for everyone watching. In situations like this, what protects you isn't always how you behave, not always calmness. Very often, it's the documents, the cameras, the records that decide everything. The difference isn't dignity. The difference is the ability to be verified. And as long as power is allowed to bypass verification in favor of assumption, stories like this will continue to appear. The only question is who will have the cameras, and who won't. If you were in Darius's position, what would you do to protect yourself while still remaining calm? And have you ever witnessed someone in authority bypass process simply because they believe they can? Leave a comment. Share this story. And if you want to continue following where power clashes with truth, where records speak louder than emotion, hit like and subscribe. Because accountability doesn't just appear. It only appears when someone forces it to appear.